purpose of Freethought Forum is to be vigilant to the encroachment of religion into government and to educate the general public as to what a freethinker is.
My thoughts give me power.
No scholar can map them.
No hunter can trap them. No person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei. No person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei.
Welcome to Freethought Forum. I am your host, Hugh Henry. Since February is Black Freedom Month, we have a guest on here to talk about the history of Black Freethought from Frederick Douglass to the present. My guest is Mr. Phillip Krumm. He is the owner of the
Ship Bookstore.
Ship Bookstore, a composer, a writer, and a bookman. He has been on our show before, and I'm honored to have him back. And this is a subject about which I know very, very little.
Well, I've had to learn a bit about it myself, Hugh, and I've kind of enjoyed it. It's been a lot of work, but I did find some interesting black atheists and agnostics, which I didn't know there were any of. But I would say, I'd like to say something about your last week's show, which I enjoyed very much with Catherine and James Barrett.
Well, thank you.
You did some book reviews. This will be a sort of some slight book reviews too, but there were two things I thought I would mention. One good book on the nature of perception. You were talking about the nature of the mind and how it perceives. The best book I ever read on that subject was The Crack in the Cosmic Egg by Joseph Chilton Pearce. It is a remarkable book on the nature of consciousness and perception, and anyone who's interested in that subject would find it, I think, actually mind-changing. They call it a brain cracker. It's one of the most extraordinary books I ever read. You can't read it and not be changed by it because the book itself is a process, and quite an incredible work. Also, the people who see the visions and the nature of the Virgin Mary effect. A good book on that not many people know about. Carl Jung wrote a book called Flying Saucers, and it deals with the same aspect of perception. He believed that life itself, the world that we see, is a psychic event. Consequently, everything that happens in it is a psychic event, and he saw no difference between Virgin Marys and flying saucers. And
I would agree with you on that.
There is no difference. They are the same. Flying saucers are just as phony as Virgin Marys are. There are people all over the world every single day looking through telescopes all over space, and not a one of them has ever seen a flying saucer.
No.
And they're strictly a hallucinatory effect, and generally the people who see them are two or three drunks down on the banks of Mississippi somewhere drinking and seeing flying saucers.
Well, that's where we're going to disagree in part because I'm a member of the Mutual UFO Network. However, at recent conventions, the idea that whatever the heck it is, it's extraterrestrial, called the extraterrestrial hypothesis, is going down the tubes.
Yeah.
So they're agreeing that we still don't know what it is. I like the U myself.
Mm-hmm. Well,
but whatever it is, it didn't come from someplace outside the solar system.
No, it's a construction of consciousness, just like everything. The problem is we're only beginning to understand the nature of human perception. And what Joseph Chilton Pearce points out in his book with a lot of help and from a lot of science is that the mind constructs the universe. As Henry Adams says in the Education of Henry Adams, each of us must bear our own universe.
I agree completely.
And the nature of consciousness and construction of all that takes place in here, and what we see takes place in there. So anyway, that's one of several things I wanted to talk about. The reason this show came up and why they asked me to do Frederick Douglass was that back when I had an actual physical bookstore, I read a little bit of the narrative of Frederick Douglass, which is his first book. He wrote 3 autobiographies. This one he wrote in 1845, which was a life-changing experience for him, because one thing was that when by writing the book he revealed that he had learned how to read and write, which was very definitely against the law, and as mentioned throughout the book, several people suffered seriously for trying to teach him to read, and also that he had escaped bondage. So by writing this book, he had to leave the country, and he went to England for 2 years, and then he came back and joined the abolitionist movement. But I hope to take up a certain amount of time with Frederick Douglass and read you several, I think, really remarkable passages from this very extraordinary autobiography, and mention a couple of other very good books on him that have come out, and then cover as many of these interesting black atheists and freethinkers as we have time for. But I hope to veer wildly from topic to topic, because there are several subjects that are related to what the slavery era meant in America. There are things like capitalism and property, and what the effect of property, people as property, was, a very important subject. And then also the subject of white supremacy, which is a really interesting topic, which Frederick Douglass deals with, pardon me. But he was born in Maryland, which a lot of, I must say, when I came to Texas in 1949, there wasn't anyone down here that realized that Maryland was a southern state.
It's the one just south of the Mason-Dixon line.
It's the first state south of the Mason-Dixon line.
It was not part of the Confederacy because the federal troops made darn sure it wasn't, and it had the most famous auction block in Annapolis, which is still there. I believe it was one of the great first auction blocks of slavery, of slaves coming into the country.
I believe that's true. But also I would point out that my great-grandfather, my mom's grandfather, used to enjoy telling everybody how we massacred the Massachusetts troops when they came through Baltimore. But anyway, he was born in Tuckahoe on the eastern coast of Maryland, and he was born in either 1817 or 1818. He wasn't very sure about that, and he points out that most slaves did not know their birthdays. In fact, didn't know what birthdays were. He made up a birthday, February 14th, and he didn't know much about his mother. He said, a want of information concerning my own history was a source of unhappiness to me even during childhood. The white children could tell their ages, and I could not tell why I ought to be deprived of the same privilege. His mother was named Harriet Bailey. It's believed that another interesting aspect of coming to America and living in America is that people have to change their names to suit the American style. It's believed that his mother's name was Belali, which was a common African name, and that Belali made into Bailey fairly easily. It says, my mother was named Harriet Bailey. She was the daughter of Isaac and Betsy Bailey, both colored and quite dark. My mother was of a darker complexion than either my grandmother or grandfather. My father was a white man. It was whispered that my master was my father. Of the correctness of this opinion, I know nothing. But he gradually found out that more than likely it was the slave master named Anthony who was his father. So he was the result of miscegenation, which is something that comes into play a number of times during his life. He says, I do not recollect of ever seeing my mother by the light of day. She was with me in the night. She would lie down with me and get me to sleep, but long before I waked, she was gone. Very little communication ever took place between us. Death soon ended what little we could have while she lived, and with it her hardships and suffering. She died when I was about 7 years old on one of my master's farm near Lee's Mill. I was not allowed to be present during her illness, at her death, or burial. She was gone long before I knew anything about it. Never having enjoyed to any extent her soothing presence, her tender and watchful care, I received the tidings of her death with much the same emotions I would probably have felt at the death of a stranger.
Having moved here from Maryland, I know that eastern shore is pretty much little changed in many ways from the time of Mr. Douglass.
Oh, I wish that a great many things had changed a great deal more than they have.
Yes.
I think that all we've done is we've moved the slavery up a notch to where everybody gets a little of it.
Well, one of the great counties around Washington, Prince George's County, when segregation in schools was ended, that county ended its public education, and it did so for a number of years, rather than integrate.
I understand. Yes, that happened, and there are still people who would like to do that. He has a lot of interesting things to say about religion, and the part that played in his life. He was a religious man. You can be a free thinker and still be religious, and he was a great deal of freedom of thought, though religious. But the Christians used the myth of the story of Ham to, they believed that the descendants of Ham was the blacks, and that the Bible said that it was fine for them to be slaves. And that was the Bible part that was used to keep people enslaved. He said, it will do away with the force of the argument that God cursed Ham, and therefore American slavery is right. If the lineal descendants of Ham are alone to be scripturally enslaved, it is certain that slavery at the South must soon become unscriptural. For thousands are ushered into the world annually who, like myself, owe their existence to white fathers, and those fathers most frequently their own masters. And he could see that miscegenation was going to water down the Ham story very well. He said, he talks about the master. He said it required extraordinary barbarity on the part of an overseer to affect the slave owner. He was a cruel man, hardened by a long life of slaveholding. He would at times seem to take great pleasure in whipping a slave. I've often been awakened at the dawn of day by the most heart-rending shrieks of an aunt of mine, whom he used to tie up on a joist and whip upon her naked back until she was literally covered with blood. No words, no tears, no prayers. He's talking about his Aunt Hester, who was actually a young woman. From his gory victim seemed to move his iron heart from its bloody purpose. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped. And where the blood ran fastest, there he whipped longest. He would whip her to make her scream and whip her to make her hush, and not until overcome by fatigue would he cease to swing the blood-clotted cowskin whip. I remember the first time I ever witnessed this horrible exhibition. I was quite a child, but I remember it. I'll never forget it while I remember anything. It was the first of a long series of such outrages, of which I was doomed to be a witness and participant. It struck me with awful force. It was the blood-stained gate, the entrance to the hell of slavery through which I was about to pass. It was a most terrible spectacle. I wish I could commit to paper the feelings with which I beheld it.
It sounds like a variation on rape.
Well, there was a lot of that too, of course.
Because it's violent and it's sexual at the same time.
There's a good deal of that, because you see, these people were their property. And when a human being is your property, you can do with them what you will, and there's no one who can say anything about it. And there was this attitude that any white man, no matter how awful, was superior to any black man, no matter how wonderful, which has, of course, now been moved to other groups, but nonetheless is still a popular idea.
Yeah, post-Darwin, they justified it using Darwinian arguments instead of the biblical ones.
Well, I want to read some of this passage because it's quite strong. He has a good way of writing. He's quite a powerful writer, and so a certain amount of this program I want to read from this extraordinary work, which there is nothing else like it. He says, he's talking about the Aunt Hester experience. He says, this occurrence took place very soon after I went to live with my old master and under the following circumstances. Aunt Hester went out one night, where or for what I do not know, and happened to be absent when my master desired her presence. He had ordered her not to go out evenings and warned her that she must never let him catch her in company with a young man who was paying attention to her belonging to Colonel Lloyd. The young man's name was Ned Roberts, generally called Lloyd's Ned. Why master was so careful of her may be safely left to conjecture. She was a woman of noble form and of graceful proportions, having very few equals and fewer superiors in personal appearance among the colored or white women of our neighborhood. Aunt Hester had not only disobeyed his orders in going out, but had been found in company with Lloyd's Ned, which circumstance I found from what he had said while whipping her was the chief offense. Had he been a man of pure morals himself, he might have been thought interested in protecting the innocence of my aunt. But those who knew him will not suspect him of any such virtue. Before he commenced whipping Aunt Hester, he took her into the kitchen and stripped her from neck to waist, leaving her neck, shoulders, and back entirely naked. He then told her to cross her hands, calling her at the same time a damned bitch. After crossing her hands, he tied them with a strong rope and led her to a stool under a large hook in the joist, put for the purpose. He made her get upon the stool and tied her hands to the hook. She now stood fair for his infernal purpose. Her arms were stretched up at their full length so that she stood upon the ends of her toes. He then said to her, "Now, you damned bitch, I'll learn you how to disobey my orders." And after rolling up his sleeves, he commenced to lay on the heavy cowskin whip, and soon the warm red blood, amid heart-rending shrieks from her and horrid oaths from him, came dripping to the floor. I was so terrified and horror-stricken at the sight that I hid myself in a closet and dared not venture out until long after the bloody transaction was over. I expected it would be my turn next. It was all new to me. I had never seen anything like it before. I had always lived with my grandmother on the outskirts of the plantation, where she was put to raise the children of younger women. I had therefore been, until now, out of the way of the bloody scenes that occurred on the plantation. Well, he moves from place to place. He is swapped with other people, and he finally wound up, he went to a family called Auld, who were a little bit decent, and Mrs. Auld attempted to teach him to write, but Mr. Auld found out about that and put a quick nix on it. Mrs. Auld was severely reprimanded for trying to teach him. Slaves not only were forbidden to learn to read, but also to learn, of course, to learn to write. And if they did, frequently they were punished by having their hands cut off. He said, on the 1st of January, 1834, I left Mr. Covey, this last man, and went to live with Mr. Freeland, who lived about 3 miles from St. Michael's. This is still in Maryland.
Yeah, I know where it is.
I found Mr. Freeland a very different man from Mr. Covey. Though not rich, he was what would be called an educated Southern gentleman. Mr. Covey, as I have shown, was a well-trained Negro breaker and slave driver. Mr. Freeland, slaveholder though he was, seemed to possess some regard for honor, some reverence for justice, and some respect for humanity. The latter seemed totally insensible to all such sentiments. Mr. Freeland had many faults peculiar to slaveholders, such as being very passionate and fretful. But I must do him the justice to say that he was exceedingly free from those degrading vices to which Mr. Covey was addicted. He was open and frank, and we always knew where to find him. Mr. Covey, however, was an artful deceiver and could be understood only by such as were skillful enough to detect his cunningly devised frauds. Another advantage I gained in my new master was he made no pretensions to or profession of religion, and this, in my opinion, was truly a great advantage. I assert most unhesitatingly that the religion of the South is a mere covering for the most horrid crimes, a justifier of the most appalling barbarity, a sanctifier of the most hateful frauds, and a dark shelter under which the darkest, foulest, grossest, and most infernal deeds of slaveholders find the strongest protection. Were I to be again reduced to the chains of slavery, next to that enslavement, I should regard being the slave of a religious master the greatest calamity that could befall me. For of all slaveholders with whom I have ever met, religious slaveholders are the worst. I have ever found them the meanest and basest and most cruel and cowardly of all others. It was my unhappy lot not only to belong to a religious slaveholder, but to live in a community of such religionists. Very near Mr. Freeland lived the Reverend Daniel Wheaton, and he whipped his slaves endlessly. Well, he goes on quite a bit, but whipping slaves was done in advance of their needing it. It was done just to make sure that they kept their slave state. He said, I agreed to do so. He had to go to a Sunday school. He said, I agreed to do so and accordingly devoted my Sundays to teaching those of my fellow slaves how to read. Neither of them knew his letters when I was there. Some of the slaves of the neighboring farms found what was going on and availed themselves of this opportunity to learn to read. It was understood among all who came that there must be as little display about it as possible. It was necessary to keep our religious masters unacquainted with the fact that instead of spending the Sabbath wrestling, boxing, and drinking whiskey, we were trying to learn to read, for they had much rather see us engaged in those degrading sports than to see us behaving like intellectual, moral, and accountable beings. My blood boils as I think of the bloody manner in which these gentlemen, both class leaders, in connection with many others, rushed in upon us with sticks and stones and broke up our virtuous little Sabbath school, all calling themselves Christians. I think that these precious souls today, talking about the folks that he was with and trying to teach, shut up in the prison house of slavery, my feelings overcome me, and I'm almost ready to ask, does a righteous God govern the universe?
What was the Southern feeling about blacks having souls? Were they supposed to or not?
Oh, yeah, they came under the brutes category.
So they were supposed to be animals?
Yes, they were treated like animals. No, they didn't get into the group. They weren't part of the group at all. In fact, that'll get me a chance to veer off a little bit, which is to to talk about a little bit about an interesting thing since we're doing Black History Month, and that is the concept of white supremacy and the part it played in our history. And it was just taken for granted. It was taken for granted. It was just common knowledge that we whites were better because of our whiteness. We were smarter, cleaner, healthier, happier. No one could be as good as we were.
That was a presumption in Texas at the time of the Revolution, which is why they figured they could stay at the Alamo, because any Texan could beat up, any number of Mexicans.
That's right. That's right. Well, but here's what's interesting. I think it's good to point out, and PBS has been doing a lot of shows. They did several shows in January in advance of Black History Month, which I think were worthy of mention. Some of them made me very, very angry. Some I found very stimulating, and they relate to what we're talking about. One was the murder of Emmett Till, the story of the 14-year-old black boy that was murdered by the white people, the white guys in the South in Mississippi in 1955. He was a very intelligent white boy who had come down from Chicago, which was where people were a little bit more with it. And he went into a cafe one day, into a little grocery store one day, and he made the grossly important mistake of whistling at an attractive white woman. And a night or two later, two white men came with flashlight and gun and dragged him out of bed and took him out into a little cabin and beat him for a long time, killed him, shot him in the head, took a barbed wire, wrapped it around his neck to a weight, and threw him in the river. And they found him. Some fishermen found him, and they brought the case. People came down from Chicago to try the case. The white men were put on trial. And of course, in Mississippi in the South, nothing happened. They were freed. And it was a horrible story. The case was appealed. Nothing happened on the appeal. The mother of the boy, who was a very intelligent woman who was interviewed on the program, she wrote to President Eisenhower. Several people wrote to President Eisenhower, who, as we know, was a boring dullard.
Well, more than that, he considered civil rights to be a problem, the agitation for it. Mm-hmm. He considered it to be agitation and causing trouble. He said that he only made 2 mistakes in his White House term, and both of them were sitting on the Supreme Court.
Yeah, very good point. Well, he was dreadful, very much in opposition to Harry Truman, who actually did a great deal of civil rights legislation that was later logged down during the Eisenhower time.
Well, he desegregated the armed forces, but Harry Truman was the only president we've had that I know of who was in fact a former member of the Ku Klux Klan.
President, yeah, we had quite a. We still have some Congress people.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, Trent Lott was.
Yeah.
Trent Lott was very proud of his Klansmanship, and there's another one, I can't think of his name right now, but yes, they're still around. They're still very involved in all that stuff. Another show that they did during January related to Black history that I thought was good. They did 2 shows. One was very good, and I thought one was very dull, and they were both on the subject of the Jasper incident, here in Jasper, Texas, where the white guys, the 3 white supremacist guys, took the black man and chained him to the back of their pickup truck and dragged him down a country road.
That was only a couple of years ago.
Very recently, yes. They dragged him down a country road until he was knocked to pieces, literally knocked to pieces. And they did quite differently, they did all get convicted. But it brought up an interesting point. They didn't all talk to the camera, but the main guy, whose name I don't remember right now, he had white tattooed down one arm and white power tattooed down the other arm, and the little zigzags that the little neo-Nazi jerks think are so cool, the SS.
Yeah, the SS symbol.
Yeah, the little SS lightning symbol, and a whole lot of other junk tattooed all over his body. And he was on, they talked to him a little bit, and he said it was a terrible problem, the pollution of the white race, and that it was very important that people speak out against the pollution, the intermarriage of the races, and the pollution of the white race. And it reminded me once again, how much one should say, "Oh yes, thank you, you stupid, dull-witted pig. look who's defending the white race. It's always imbeciles. It's always ninth-rate boneheads with an IQ of 11 who feel that it's their duty to protect the glorious white race from pollution by other races, which is hopeless. It's been hopeless for 1,000 years.
By the way, we're running close to the end of the program, so if there's something you need to get in, you better get it in
really?
soon.
You're kidding.
No, I'm not.
Oh my God, it's been
You've been
great.
rolling.
Oh, I'm amazed. We won't even get to the Black Freethinkers. So, well, okay, I do want to read you a little something. How much have I got?
About 3 minutes.
Oh, great. This is what I read to the group when we were meeting at the bookstore, and it's the epilogue to his absolutely excellent narrative. Gee, I'm sorry, I wanted to get to some of this other stuff. He said, what I have said respecting and against religion, I mean to apply it to the slaveholding religion of this land. And I want to make sure you understand, I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land Christianity. I look upon it as the climax of all misnomers, the boldest of all frauds, and the grossest of all libels. Never was there a clearer case of stealing the livery of the court of heaven to serve the devil in. I'm filled with unutterable loathing when I contemplate the religious pomp and show together with the horrible inconsistencies which everywhere surround me. We have men stealers for ministers, women whippers for missionaries, and cradle plunderers for church members. The man who wields the blood-clotted cowskin whip during the week fills the pulpit on Sunday and claims to be a minister of the meek and lowly Jesus. The man who robs me of my earnings at the end of each week meets me as a class leader on Sunday morning to show me the way of life and the path of salvation. He who sells my sister for purposes of prostitution stands forth as the pious advocate of purity. He who proclaims it a religious duty to read the Bible denies me the right of learning to read the name of God, the God who made me. He who is the religious advocate of marriage robs whole millions of its sacred influence and leaves them to the ravages of wholesale pollution. The warm defender of the sacredness of the family relation is the same that scatters whole families, sundering husbands and wives, parents and children, sisters and brothers, leaving the hut vacant and the hearth desolate. We see the thief preaching against theft and the adulterer against the adultery. We have men sold to build churches, women sold to support the gospel, and babes sold to purchase Bibles for the poor heathen, all for the glory of God and the good of souls.
Well, there was an old Chinese philosopher, this has been attributed to Gandhi, but I think he was much too polite, who said when he was asked about Western civilization, he thought it would be a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to make the same statement about Christianity. I think it would be a good idea.
It could have been something, but it is a second-rate religion, and it's made up of junk from, actually watered-down junk from earlier religions. There's nothing. I'm sorry we didn't get to some of these other guys because they have made some good cases for the pagan origins of Christianity, which we could talk about on some other program, perhaps. I would like to mention in the time we've got left a very good Life of Frederick Douglass by William McFeely. An extraordinarily beautiful book, and a new book, Love Across Color Lines.
Okay. This is Hugh Henry for Freethought Forum. Thank you very much for being on our program, although the stuff here was pretty rough stuff. I think it needed to be said. Thank you very much, and I hope you turn it again.
I think as I please, and this gives me pleasure.
My conscience decrees, this right I must treasure.
My thoughts will not cater
To duke or dictator, no person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei.